And resume recording now so that we can get started. Today is our 6th and final meeting of the Nature Journaling program that we have been doing with the Palmetto Public Library. And this has been a great experience. It's been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to teaching this class again at some point in the future, hopefully when we can do some in-person sessions as well, to maybe go out and walk around and look at some things and practice some of the things we've talked about. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation here that I have for you today. Since we are celebrating this month, National Poetry Month, and tomorrow is Earth Day, and we partnered with the library on this program, I wanted to do something in our last meeting to kind of focus on poetry and the influence of nature on poetry, and also just kind of think about how nature journaling and poetry are connected. And so what we'll be talking about today, we're going to review some of the information from the past 6 modules, just so that we have kind of a chance to talk through some things if we need to go back and think about any of the things that we've talked about. We're going to define what poetry is, which is really hard to do, but I actually found a really great video. It's 5 minutes long. It's one of the TED Ed videos. It's fabulous, talks about what poetry is. And we're going to talk a little bit about how it's related to nature journaling, how the two things kind of coincide and work in tandem. We're going to do some practice writing with some writing prompts. And then if you'll remember, the homework from last week was to identify 1 or 2 poems that are nature related that you would really like to share with the group. And so we'll share those selected poems. I've also found 3 poems that are read by the poet themselves, and we'll listen to the recordings of those poems as read by the poet. And then we will kind of wrap up and be done. So as a review, I would like you, if you would, we think about nature journaling, right, as a tool that we can use for observing the natural world. But it's also a method of collecting data as well as a creative outlet. I would love it if you would, in the chat box, just go ahead and type in 1 or 2 words that kind of define nature journaling for you. I'll give you a couple seconds to do so. Hi, Shirley. Welcome. We're typing in the chat box 1 or 2 words that define nature journaling for us. Good. So we've got 1 response so far. Awesome. Great. So we have recording observations. I love puts me in the role of observer and opens me up to learning. That's great. And writing about my nature sketches in my journal. So not just sketching, but also writing, using those things to kind of catalyze each other. That's great. Absolutely, all of those things, a way to document what you have growing. And Patsy, I don't know if you were in the Nature Journaling for Gardeners class that I did for the Master Gardener volunteers here a couple months ago, but there are actually really great benefits to nature journaling for gardeners, specifically related to integrated pest management and companion planting and variety selection. All of those kinds of things can really be helped along by the use of keeping track of what you're doing in your garden in a nature journal. So these things are all really good ways for us to think about and approach nature journaling. If we're more of an analytical person, we can go out and we can take a lot of quantitative data, right? We can use different types of tools to measure. We can make observations over a period of time, and we can compare those observations. We can create graphical representations of the data that we are keeping track of, right? We can do all of these kind of quantitative tasks in a nature journal, but we also can use it as a creative outlet, as a way to document not only what we see, but also how we feel. Also thinking about the ways that what we're observing interacts with the broader ecosystem, and kind of our own place within nature. In our first class, we tried to define nature, right? What is nature? And we found that it's kind of a tricky thing to define, because there are all of these ideas out there about what nature is and what nature might represent to different people. But I think we all kind of came to the conclusion, and correct me if I'm wrong, that nature is everywhere. It doesn't have to be pristine in order for it to be nature. It can be something as simple as an oak tree growing near a sidewalk, right? And that can still be representative of nature, and you can still have an experience that is considered a nature experience in those areas. And I also want to point out kind of the difficulty in isolating nature to these kind of pristine areas is really exclusive, and it really kind of puts a barrier to experiencing nature for people who don't have access to those pristine areas. So when I think about nature, I really want to be careful to define it as something that is inclusive rather than exclusive, right? We are in and of nature as humans, but we don't always perceive of it that way. We talked a lot about the health benefits of nature journaling in the first class, and a lot of these health benefits are associated with time spent in the outdoors, right? So you could find a lot of these health benefits if you were just kind of going out for a walk in nature, or in a green area. But some of the things that are specific to nature journaling are things like sharpening and maintaining your observational skills, encouraging mindfulness, right? And encouraging your technical expertise or creative expertise in folks who might be on one side or the other of that coin, right? So by practicing kind of quantitative observations, you can encourage yourself to become more technically minded if you're somebody who tends to be more creative, and vice versa. If you tend to be more technically minded and you really like that quantitative data, you can look at the data that you've collected, and you can try to find a creative way to represent it in your nature journal. Obviously, journaling in general is a really great tool for mindfulness, for recognizing where you are in the present moment. Nature journaling in of itself is a way for us to capture a moment, right? It's a way for us to think about where we are in this present space and time. And so it demands mindfulness of us. And along with mindfulness come things like decreased stress, and we also can see that people who, there's pretty good research on this, people who are performing observational tasks and documenting them and journaling are maintaining the plasticity in their brains, right? So maintaining kind of that ability to learn and create new neural connections and things like that. And I have all of these resources and research. If you want to review them, I can provide you with some of those if you send me an email. So we kind of moved on after that from basic understanding of what nature journaling is and nature itself and the health benefits of nature journaling to talk more specifically about, okay, what are we going to be observing and how can we kind of look at the traits of these things that we're observing and maybe identify some of them, right? And so some of the things I want to review for identifying plants, trees, mushrooms, what have you, is the concept that form follows function, right? When you look at the images here on the screen, we can see that these different species have adaptations based on some kind of function that they need to perform in order to successfully reproduce or grow to maturity, right? So you can see these really beautiful flowers here with the really long anthers. And so these long anthers are sticking way out there, and they really want that pollen to get knocked around, and they really want to spread that pollen around, right? This mushroom here, it's got this really pretty red cap and this nice bright white stalk, and it's going to attract something to come and munch on it. Russulas are commonly consumed by squirrels, and then the spores get spread around the forest, and then the mushroom is able to grow and expand, right? Red mangroves are masters of adaptation with their adventitious roots, where they can reach out into the water, hold themselves up, right? And they exclude salt from their bodies by closing up those lenticels and protecting themselves from salt water. So the form of different plants and trees is going to follow some kind of function that plant needs to perform in order to be reproductively successful. When thinking about leaf shape and arrangement, this is a really great opportunity for you to draw or to do a leaf rubbing in your nature journal. So when you're doing this, think about scale. So try to, if you're just sketching out a leaf shape, try to give yourself something for scale there so that you can remember how large the leaf was, or just go ahead and do a leaf rubbing directly into your nature journal so that you have a representation of that leaf. You can see the margins, you can see the veination, and then mark down, write a note next to it. Was this only one leaf? Is it part of a compound leaf? If it is part of a compound leaf, how many leaflets were there? Was it an odd number? Was it an even number? Because those types of things are going to help you in your identification. When you're looking at identifying trees, right? Something that you can do with your nature journal is you can describe the bark texture and color. You can describe the shape of the tree. And when you're looking at bark texture, this is also another opportunity for you to do a bark rubbing directly into your journal. And this is going to help you see those ridges within the bark or the plates, whatever kind of tree you're looking at, right? How about, here's a question I think some of you will know is, if it's plates, if you have plated bark on a tree, what kind of tree is it most likely to be? Does anybody know?
Maybe a pine.
Absolutely right. Yep, pine trees are going to have those plates of bark. And that's really easy to see when you do those bark rubbings. So think about things like color too. Color on bark is difficult to use as an identifying characteristic, mainly because there are a lot of environmental factors that could change the color of the bark. Think about things growing on the bark like lichen. Think about maybe there was a fire a couple years ago that darkened the bark and changed the color there. Maybe you're in an environment that tends to be more wet than the surrounding areas, and so the bark is going to be a little bit darker. Maybe it's just moist there. Maybe there's moss growing on it. So bark color can be a little bit tricky, but texture is really good to help identify trees. Think about the presence or absence of flowers, and then what type of flower it is. So when you're writing down notes in your nature journal about flowers, you can try to sketch them, but at least count the petals if you can, or kind of describe, is it cup shaped? Is it daisy-like? Is it, let's see, what else could you say besides cup shaped, daisy-like? Is it trumpet shaped, right? Think about the trumpet shaped flowers. And when you write those things down, that can help you in identifying the plant. And also think about something like a trumpet shaped flower. What might pollinate a trumpet shaped flower?
Hummingbirds.
Absolutely right. Yeah, hummingbirds. So if you find an area that has a lot of trumpet-shaped flowers, or a plant that has a really nice trumpet-shaped flower that's got a lot of them on it, it might be a good spot for you to revisit and watch for hummingbirds, right? Because they tend to frequent those trumpet-shaped flowers. Patsy, did you have something?
No.
Okay.
Good.
And then when thinking about things like mushrooms and also just any of the plants or trees, think about the overall shape, right? So plants, whether they're going to be prostrate, kind of growing across the ground, are they viney? Are they shrubby? Are they leggy or are they compact, right? Same thing goes for trees. Do they have lots of branches coming off of a central trunk, or do they have just a few? Are they globular in shape? Are they pyramidal in shape, right? Remember how we drew those tree shapes? Think about where they're growing, what type of substrate they're growing in, meaning is the soil very sandy? Is it, does it have clay in it? Is it very mucky? How can you tell if a soil is wet very frequently?
Sometimes you can see where the water rises and then recedes.
Yep, so certain tree species will have a water line on them, right? You can see that water line on the plant itself. What about what characteristic of the soil might you be able to notice?
Would the color change, darker?
Yes, the color would probably be darker. There'd probably be more organic matter in it because a soil that doesn't drain as quickly would also tend to kind of hold on to organic matter. The soil would probably smell kind of funny because as soil retains moisture and organic matter, that organic matter decomposes at a slower rate and it releases sulfur compounds when it decomposes. So a kind of mucky or soil that stays wet for long periods of time tends to have a certain odor to it. So you might be able to just grab a handful and smell it and make a determination about the type of substrate. Habitat. Remember in our previous program, we talked about habitat types that are common to our area. So things like longleaf pine remnant areas where we have flatwoods and prairies, we have swamps, we have estuaries, we have dune and coastal systems. So you'll find different conglomerations of species within those different habitat types. And so those are all useful to write down when you're making your observations. Is there anything you think that you would like to add or any questions that you have on the material from the previous classes?
No, there was a lot of material.
Yeah, there was a lot of material.
Yeah, there was. I tried to pull out some of the highlights, and remember too that I'm going to be putting all of these together in a YouTube playlist, and as soon as that's ready, I'm going to be sending that out to everybody who participated, so you'll be able to review the materials in those YouTube videos. All right, we'll go ahead and move on then. So I want to ask you the question, what is poetry? How do you define poetry?
That's tricky.
Mm-hmm. Anyone have a thought? If you don't, that's okay. It's hard to do. You know, you start, go ahead, Christine.
Well, I mean, some poetry is rhyming. To me, poetry is, it evokes an emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's my first thought about poetry too, is that it's something that you can feel, right? It's a way of writing that makes you feel something. It's different than prose and literature in that way. It's different than technical writing, obviously, but yeah, poetry is evocative. And so I found this really great short video, it's 5 minutes. I shared my computer sound, so you should be able to hear this just fine. I'm going to go ahead and play this video because I think it does a really good job of explaining what poetry is. hear it?
Yes.
Muhammad Ali spent years training to become the greatest boxer the world had ever seen, but only moments to create the shortest poem. Ali captivated Harvard's graduating class in 1975 with his message of unity and friendship. When he finished, the audience wanted more. They wanted a poem. Ali delivered what is considered the shortest poem ever. Me, we. Or is it me, we? No one's really sure. Regardless, if these two words are a poem, then what exactly makes a poem a poem? Poets themselves have struggled with this question, often using metaphors to approximate a definition. Is a poem a little machine, a firework, an echo, a dream? Poetry generally has certain recognizable characteristics. 1. Poems emphasize language's musical qualities. This can be achieved through rhyme, rhythm, and meter, from the sonnets of Shakespeare to the odes of Confucius to the Sanskrit Vedas. 2. Poems use condensed language, like literature with all the water wrung out of it. 3. Poems often feature intense feelings, from Rumi's spiritual poetry to Pablo Neruda's Ode to an Onion. Poetry, like art itself, has a way of challenging simple definitions. While the rhythmic patterns of the earliest poems were a way to remember stories even before the advent of writing, a poem doesn't need to be lyrical. Reinhard Doll's Apfel and Eugen Gomringer's Silencio toe the line between visual art and poetry. Meanwhile, E. Cummings wrote poems whose shapes were as important as the words themselves, in this case, amplifying the sad loneliness of a single leaf falling through space. If the visual nature of poetry faded into the background, perhaps we'd be left with music. And that's an area that people love to debate. Are songs poems? Many don't regard songwriters as poets in a literary sense, but lyrics from artists like Paul Simon, Bob Dylan, and Tupac Shakur often hold up even without the music. In rap, poetic elements like rhyme, rhythm, and imagery are inseparable from the form. Take this lyric from the Notorious B.I.G. I can hear sweat trickling down your cheek. Your heartbeats sound like Sasquatch feet, thundering, shaking the concrete. So far, all the examples we've seen have had line breaks. We can even imagine the two words of Ali's poem organizing in the air: me, we. Poetry has a shape that we can usually recognize. Its line breaks help readers navigate the rhythms of a poem. But what if those line breaks disappeared? Would it lose its essence as a poem? Maybe not. Enter the prose poem. Prose poems use vivid images and wordplay, but are formatted like paragraphs. When we look at poetry less as a form and more as a concept, we can see the poetic all around us. Spiritual hymns, the speeches of orators like Martin Luther King Jr., JFK, and Winston Churchill, and surprising places like social media. In 2010, journalist Joanna Smith tweeted updates from the earthquake in Haiti. Was in B-room getting dressed when heard my name. Tremor. Ran outside through sliding door. All still now. Safe. Roosters crowing. Smith uses language in a way that is powerful, direct, and filled with vivid images. Compare her language to a haiku, the ancient Japanese poetic form that emphasizes bursts of brief intensity, with just 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. The waters of poetry run wide and deep. Poetry has evolved over time, and perhaps now more than ever, the line between poetry, prose, song, and visual art has blurred. However, one thing has not changed. The word poetry actually began in verb form, coming from the ancient Greek poiesis, which means to create. Poets, like craftsmen, still work with the raw materials of the world to forge new understandings and comment on what it is to be human in a way only humans can. Dartmouth researchers tested this idea by asking robots to pen poetry. A panel of judges sorted through stacks of sonnets to see if they could distinguish those made by man and machine. You may be happy to know that while scientists have successfully used artificial intelligence in manufacturing, medicine, and even journalism, poetry is a different story. the robots were caught red-handed 100% of the time.
So I really thought that was a great synopsis of what poetry is. And it really is just a way to organize language that is evocative and feeling provoking and thought provoking. Can be as simple as 2 or 3 words, or it could be as much as 3 or 4 paragraphs, depending on the type of poetry that you like to write or that you like to read. And so I really think that does a good job of talking about poetry. And I love that they talk about rap as poetry, because I get a lot of side eye for liking rap music. But I tell people all the time, you have to listen to the lyrics, and sometimes you have to read the lyrics. It's poetry, and there's a lot of really interesting linguistic strategies that are used in good rap music. So what is the connection then between poetry and nature journaling? Well, they tend to have a long history of happening at the same time, right? There are a lot of naturalists who also wrote poems about nature, or who wrote about nature in a way that was poetic. Think about somebody like John Muir, right? John Muir wrote all these observations about nature, and he did it in such a way that his language was very poetic. And it's now, every environmental t-shirt has a John Muir quote on it, right? That's not just because he's famous, but it's also because his language was really beautiful. And so I think that there is a connection between the ability to kind of sit still in one place and observe the natural world, and then wanting to write about how that makes you feel. And so I think that it's not strange that nature journaling and poetry tend to kind of go hand in hand. And I also think that it's a really great way of allowing us to capture the feeling of a place, of a time, of our own sense of self. I know I actually, I jokingly sent my husband a quick poem that I wrote the other day via text. And he's like, I don't quite get it. And so I responded with a really paragraph long explanation of what the poem was only like 4 lines long. And it took me a paragraph to try to explain what the poem was about. And I think that poetry allows you to condense feeling into a much smaller package. And so I really, the concept of capturing that feeling, right? You're out in nature, you're taking down these observations, you're writing down what you see. Why shouldn't you also write down how you feel and how you think about yourself and how you think about the world around you? And I think that poetry lets us do that. And it can be as simple as something like a haiku, right? 575 syllables, and you have captured the essence of a place and a time. Poets are also keen observers. And so when we think about nature journaling as a way to expand our ability to observe the natural world, poets are already doing this, but they're not doing it necessarily just about nature, right? They're doing it about the human experience, or their own experience, or industry, or justice, or pick any topic. And there's a poet out there who has made strong and important and evocative observations of the current culture that we're in. Think about the inauguration of President Biden recently, and Amanda Gorman's poem that she read. I'm getting goosebumps now just talking about it, because of the sense of the place that we're in and the emotion that was caught up in that moment for her and for everybody else. And that's not a political statement. She just did such a good job of encapsulating kind of how everybody was feeling. And she did it in a really, concise and beautiful way. And so poets are keen observers. And I think that there's something to people who want to go out and observe nature and having that ability to also be poets themselves, right? Because you're already being close with your observations. I want to point out though, too, I did a Google search when I was preparing for this class, and I just typed in like famous nature poets, right, to see what would come up. They were all white. All of them. They were all white. They were all European or American, and most of them were men. And a lot of them were from the 1800s. When you look at like lists that you can find for teachers to teach poetry to students in school, most of these lists are white people. They're Western, and there is not a lot of diversity in what is considered kind of nature poetry. Some of the most famous nature poets are people like Emily Dickinson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, Wendell Berry, and Mary Oliver. Wendell Berry, you'll hear from him in a minute. He's actually one of my favorites. I love him, as well as Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is also one of my favorites, but I will acknowledge that they are both white guys. And so when we kind of expose ourselves to poetry, I think it's really important to try to expand our idea of what is considered nature poetry, and also to read poets that are not from Europe or America, to read poets who maybe are writing in a different language originally and we're reading the translated version, reading contemporary poets, because contemporary nature poetry is very different than the poetry from the 1800s, right? Think about Percy Byron Shelley, Mary Shelley's brother. He is, you'll find him in some of those lists of poets as well. He was an English nobleman. He got a chance to go sit out in the countryside and observe the pastoral scenes. And he wrote his poetry about these, these pastoral scenes that he could see because of the leisure of his position in society. And so his nature poetry is going to be very different from someone who's writing about their polluted water in their neighborhood, right? And so I think it's good to think about these things. And I did put in the chat box, I'm going to go ahead and I'll re-link it for the folks that came a little bit later. The Poetry Society did a really great series of interviews with poets on environmental justice. And so looking at poetry as a tool for spreading the information, the feeling, the culture, the concept of environmental justice. And so I definitely recommend you check out this link, and you can see these interviews with poets, and it also has the poem that they're referencing, so you can read some of these poems by different authors, different poets. I really thought this was a great resource. Are there any questions so far, or any thoughts?
I like the idea of using poetry. I've never thought of it before, but whenever I'm making notes in my nature journal, it seems like it doesn't have to be real wordy. You can make it short and concise. And I like the idea of using poetry as a means of writing down my thoughts. And I never thought about that before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be for anyone else either, right? That's the beauty of poetry. I write poetry a lot, and most of it is just for me. It's just for me to read and remember where I was at that moment in time, or because I'm working through something, right? I'm working through some kind of a decision or an emotion or some kind of stress that I'm having. And in writing it down, in putting it on paper and thinking about how those emotions are affecting me in my my daily life, right? I can move past those things. And so poetry can really be a tool for kind of stress relief, but also just general mental well-being. But even as simple as writing a 5-word poem about the color of a tomato, right? But you'll remember if you read that poem, what that tomato looked like, right? Because it puts you back in that place. So we're going to practice a little bit. And this is not, don't feel like you have to share anything you write. I'm going to write with you guys too. So I'm going to get my notebook out. And there are 3 writing prompts. You can pick one or do all 3, but we're going to take, let's see, what time is it? We're going to take 10 minutes. Okay, I know that's a long time, and if we're done before then, that's fine too. But I'd like to take 10 minutes, look at these writing prompts, and just write down what comes to mind based on these writing prompts. The first one is, imagine walking past a tree and it begins to talk to you. What would it say? The second one is, what is your first memory of ripe fruit? Can you describe it? And the third one is, what does it feel like to be a leaf in the sun? So again, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to mute myself, but let's take some time, pick one or do all 3, and then you don't have to share. This is just for you. All right, how's everybody doing? Good. All right. Does anybody want to share? It was just for you, so you don't have to. Just asking. Patsy, you'll share?
Sure, sure. I chose Imagine walking past a tree and it begins to talk to you. What would it say? Hey, look at me. Am I tall? Am I small? Am I broad? Am I squat? How do I make you feel? Comfortable or cautious? Am I doing my job? Carry on.
Excellent. That's very good. Like that a lot.
I'll share. Mine's short and sweet. Step lightly, look up, enjoy the view.
Great. I love it. Very good. I wrote for that one too. Bending breath, the chlorophyll whispers, memories of sunny days, and that tumultuous storm. Gathering clouds in the canopy, breath, exhaling, a mantra that elucidates peace. Anybody do any of the other writing prompts?
I did what's it feel like to be a leaf in the sun?
Mhm.
Turning, straining to capture that warm, bright light.
Great. So good. I love that because that makes me think about how plants move throughout the day. Yeah, I love that. That's good. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and so I like this activity because a lot of people don't think they're good at poetry. And then they get the opportunity to try, and it's not that hard. And humans are pretty good at it. And so I think it's kind of confidence building. So I hope you enjoyed that. And you know, you can even in your nature journal, you could write down little prompts for yourself. You know, just like flip forward a few pages, write down a prompt, a writing idea, and then when you get to that page, you can say, "Oh, right, I wanted to try writing about this," and then try jotting down a few thoughts. So I'm gonna go to this web page now. This is actually one of my favorite poems of all time. I'm gonna stop my share real quick. And then reshare. And make sure I've got it set to share my sound. Yep, okay. So this is one of my favorite poems ever, The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. And I'm gonna let him read it to you.
The Peace of Wild Things, written and read by Wendell Berry.
When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
I wanted to share that one. That I literally have that printed out and taped to my desk at work. That's one of my favorite ones. I always go back to that one. And this is Mary Oliver. She is also a pretty famous, kind of considered to be a nature poet. So let's go ahead and listen to her as well. Wild Geese.
Wild Geese, written and read by Mary Oliver.
You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things.
Ooh, that one gave me goosebumps. All right, and then the last one here. This is a more contemporary poet.
Crows, written and read by Marilyn Nelson.
What if to taste and see, to notice things, to stand each is up against emptiness for a moment or an eternity, images collected in consciousness like a tree alone on the horizon, is the main reason we're on the planet. The food's here of the first crow to arrive, numbers 2 and 3 at a safe distance, then approaching the hand-created taste of leftover coconut macaroons, the instant sparks in the Earth's awareness.
So all of these were from a podcast called On Being that I happened to listen to. But this is the poet, Marilyn Nelson here. She was the 2012 Poetry Society of America's Frost Medal winner for a distinguished lifetime achievement in poetry. So she's really a good poet as well. And I'll go ahead and get this back up. So I wanted to share those poems with you, and I love that I was able to find a recording of the poets reading those poems for you. And I hope that you've enjoyed kind of our celebration of poetry for the National Poetry Month final class for nature journaling. And you can see how the two things are connected and how you can kind of incorporate that into nature journaling as you go forward. I am going to put in the chat again. Oh, I didn't even notice Deborah put her poems in the chat box. Go ahead and look at them. Oh, very good. I like that. I had a really hard time remembering my first ripe fruit. I actually kind of think it was a tomato and not like a sweet fruit, because my grandpa used to grow excellent tomatoes in his backyard. But here we go. So if you would please take the time to answer the questions in this survey, and I will be reaching out in the future for opportunities to kind of join me for some in-person things. I'm hoping to schedule some nature hikes in the fall, specifically for my mushroom class series that I'm doing as well. But I think it would be neat to maybe set up a couple of nature journaling hikes as well, where we can kind of maybe practice what we talked about here, and maybe invite some other folks, maybe from our sister division over in Parks and Natural Resources that does a lot of activities with the parks and preserves. So if you're interested in those things, you'll definitely be hearing from me later in the summer. And I hope that you all enjoyed this 6-week series. I know I did. And so thank you so much for being a part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Did you receive that photograph that I sent you of the mushrooms that I saw in my compost?
Yes, I
That
too have
I-
mushrooms growing in my compost that I have not identified.
Well, I went out there and I popped it open. I had all the stuff to put in there, and I don't think that I probably would have noticed them because they were pretty spectacular and they were just so. Normally, compost isn't that pretty,
Yeah.
but that collection of mushrooms there in my compost, I almost want to throw my stuff in there, but I took a picture of it and I went ahead and.
I've found that mycelium keeps going. I've definitely got a really happy community of mushrooms growing in my compost right now. And I think it's decomposing faster because I have a lot of mycelium in there. So I just keep piling it on top of the mushrooms and it keeps growing up, and I'm sure it'll be good for my soil. I will say I did bring in I've got a little pet. Found that guy outside today and I grabbed a big chunk of it with its mycelium, and I'm gonna keep it in my office for a little while and see what happens. I want to see what color the spores are. I'm trying to identify it accurately. So all right. Well, if you don't have any last minute questions, I really appreciate this time. It's been really fun and I hope you got something out of it too. And so shoot me an email if you want, if you need anything, or if you have any suggestions or anything like that. I'm here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I
Bye.